So thanks everyone for your time today. As the invite said, there's things that frustrate me about investigations, and I thought it'd be useful to present some of the stuff I presented another webinar recently around what does the safety science research sort of hint at around some of the limitations of investigations and what's a maybe marginally better way of thinking about them. So today isn't a, how to, I'm not going to take you through 101 on what better investigations are, but I'm hoping to spark a little bit of curiosity and expose you to some of the research you might not really be familiar with. I think one of the most challenging myths of investigations is this idea of objectivity. I think it's fair to say there is a unspoken sort of belief held by quite a few people that investigations can be these really independent, neutral, mostly unbiased. I don't think anyone truly believes fully unbiased, but mostly unbiased fact-finding exercises. You go out there and these facts are just sitting out there waiting for you in the wild to find. And you can interpret and find and discuss these causes and these facts that are independent of you, the investigator. As it turns out, or as it's argued by some prominent researchers like Holnagel and others, that what we think are really objective, independent, neutral sort of facts and observations and interpretations can quite often be more constructions. Constructions in the sense of we apply our own lens to these issues based on our own experience, our biases, the types of risks, the sorts of information you have. So our worldviews, or as Holnagel called it, our accident models, shape what we actually find in accidents. So accident model in this sense isn't the ICAM or the Taproot. It's not the tool that we use. It's our mental models around how we make sense of the world. And these aren't just for safety, of course. We have these for everything. We make sense of the world. And as I'll show briefly later on, this isn't just limited evidence. Like we know around investigator priming and biases, how easy it is to influence the outcomes. So what we include in the investigation isn't just this neutral, independent, objective fact-finding exercise. Someone has to make a decision around what the scope is. What is in scope versus out of scope? What's admitted? Do we go 2 days before the incident? And why not 3? Why not 4? Do we select only one subcontractor and not another 2 subcontractors? Do we look at what's in the contract? What do we engage them to do? So the key point is these things that are apparently objective have quite a lot of subjective, qualitative judgments around what's in versus out of scope, what's relevant versus irrelevant. There's things like power imbalances. We may not want to target one of our clients. Maybe the client was central in one of these series of incidents because of contracts or resourcing or information, but we don't really want to upset them because they give us work. So that's now out of scope. So you can kind of understand how these objective fact-finding exercises aren't always the case. We call them constructions. And another one of these myths really ties into this idea of error and human error, which based on your worldview, error can or is a thing. So it's not argument that it isn't a thing. Some argue that it's more nuanced than just error as far as performance variability, but let's just assume error is a real thing. I think it is. But how we frame and how we construct our accident models, how we see the world, shapes essentially what we find. So here's an example, the 1987 Herald of Free Enterprise ferry disaster. I'm not going to go into too many details, but it was a roll-on, roll-off ferry and it capsized just shortly after departure. And the external door, the bow doors were left open at departure and then the water flooded in. And one of the findings was that the assistant boat, whose job it was to close the door, was asleep in his bunker at departure. So straight away, it could be easy to link very linearly that this was largely a factor of human error. The bosun was negligent in his duties, or his or her duties. So it really depends on how you view the world. If you view the world as far as accidents are largely the result of humans, human error, human decisions, human action or inaction, then inevitably you're going to find it. What you look for is what you find. If you believe that accidents are really nuanced, multifaceted, complex failures, like particularly large, high-risk sort of accidents, then inevitably you're going to find or construct those sorts of causes. If you believe that like chicken nuggets are central in 50% of accidents for whatever reason, then inevitably you're going to find chicken nuggets in your investigation. And there's this beautiful quote from James Rees, and I use this all the time. This is one of my slides put together from his quote, where he explains that rather than humans and our behavior and our actions or inactions, rather than being the main instigators of accidents, particularly in high risk, highly defended systems, we tend to be inheriting all these latent conditions, these issues that are created upstream well in advance of that one time that we had a really bad incident. And this is fueled by this idea of delusional clarity of hindsight, or hindsight bias, or hindsight heuristic, whatever you want to call it. Again, how you frame it, is it a bias? Is it something negative? Is it something that's neutral? Depends on your worldview. But there's quite a lot of articles that have unpacked the influences of hindsight and outcome biases. And it's not just the sociologists who apparently never create anything, they just criticize everything. That's what I've heard. This comes from cognitive psychologists too, and a whole range of social psychology in different fields where they study the influences or the lack of influence of the decisions before an accident versus the perceptions of after. And I haven't got it here, but actually there's an example of an incident at NASA. This was a scenario given to literal rocket engineers and management and other people. The participants had to rate the project manager's decisions, and they were randomly allocated one of three different conditions. So the mission either succeeded, the mission almost failed, so it did succeed, but could have been gone really bad, and then there was like a neutral condition. And what was interesting is the scenario, all the details, the decisions, none of that changed. That was all the same between the three conditions. But when people saw that there was a bad outcome, they automatically rated the project manager's performance as poorer. And this is something that's universal across humans. So even when we try not to allow the outcomes to influence our decisions, we just can't to a degree. It's really, really difficult because it's embedded within our cognitive machinery. It's served us well for millennia, but sometimes it doesn't always lead to what we're hoping. So there's this idea of hindsight bias where the past influences our future perception. So an example is when we do an investigation, it's really easy to find all the instances where someone zigged instead of zagged because we know what's happened. We know a bad thing happened, so we can easily trace all the key bad decisions, or as we construct it as bad decisions. But what we see when the smoke is cleared, knowing full well the outcomes, isn't necessarily what the operator saw at the time. Of course, we could piece all this together now. We know that the permit to work system didn't operate properly. They didn't complete the permit properly. They didn't have all the information. They didn't ask X, Y, Z questions. They didn't utilize the control as we expected. Like there's all these things that now is obvious to us after the fact that to people at the time may or may not have really been in sight. Maybe the information was there, and sometimes it is. I'm not trying to say it's always this case. But the point is, when we know the outcomes, it's really hard to disconnect ourselves from all the inputs, the things that led up to that time. So let's go back to the Herald of Free Enterprise. You could, if your worldview is really geared towards human error, saying, well, that bosun was negligent, was culpable, it might be valid. Like most of these perspectives are probably valid. There's really no scientific way I think you can completely discount whether it was human error or human negligence. I'm sure the legal system does have its ways to try to pass negligence and culpability, which it does. But another way to look at this is why was something so critical? Like you've got a ferry, and generally ferries, I think, are supposed to stay above the water. They're not submarines. They're not supposed to fill up with water. So they need to be watertight. They need to have all the doors closed. So why was something so critical left up to a single person, an assistant bosun? And why was that person asleep in their bunker? Now, I'm not going into this specific incident, but of course, I think most people who are familiar with investigations know this. There's nothing new here around. There's often more than just one factor. There's often a whole range of factors. But sometimes it can be really easy to overlook this and sort of sell one main narrative. Like, yes, there's all these other factors, but the primary root cause was X. But we see, like in this example, this clam door design couldn't be seen from the bridge, and there was no indicator in the bridge to show what the position of that door was. So the captain, whose decision it was to depart, had no visibility over it. The bosun didn't check if the door was closed, so they didn't check the assistant bosun. There was fatigue, of course, and there's a whole range of different factors. And it's really hard just to pick which one is the critical root cause. Even this idea of a root cause is challenged by some. I get this one all the time. I got a lot of grief when I post critical articles of root cause. I'm not a big fan, but we can at least recognize there's usually multiple factors, and it's really hard to sort of pin down the single factor, which is the most important. But it's easy to spin a narrative in an investigation that error was the key issue. It was someone failed to follow the procedure. And this is just another way of looking at the free enterprise from a control structure axiomat. And I want to put this slide in here to show that it's not just these pesky sociologists who are just debating and pontificating around the problems. We actually have evidence. We have proper controlled evidence of the effects of hindsight outcome bias, these delusional clarity, on the decisions and the findings of investigators, trained, experienced investigators. And even when the investigators are told, they're specifically instructed, don't allow the data and the findings to bias your decisions, they still can't avoid it. It's just a very human thing. Now, that's not supposed to be pessimistic. I'm not saying that there's no way we can improve and you can't reduce it. There absolutely is. The evidence around debiasing is patchy, but it's promising in some ways. But my point is, it's very easy to be seduced into this, well, I'm an experienced investigator with 30 years and I don't allow bias to influence me. But what's interesting about this one was even the influence of uncheckable information like opinions were found to affect the participants' judgments of the event. So this study looked at data that the investigator could verify at the time or couldn't verify, like just hearsay and opinions and things like that. And biasing background info about the worker affected the experienced investigators' judgments about the event. So if an eyewitness account said something like they were reckless, they're lazy, they're a complacent person, this ultimately affected the judgments of experienced investigators, even when they had no direct evidence to support it. And participants struggled at times to differentiate between checkable versus uncheckable information. So that even at the time, they struggled to work out, is that an opinion? Is that validated, cross-referenced evidence or data? So for these authors at least, and there's a few of these studies from these researchers, the first step in fact-checking is to isolate the incident to be fact-checked. And in fact, police investigators tend to be pretty good at this. They have a whole range of techniques around separating witnesses, around breaking down events into different phases. There's techniques around where you delay actually introducing certain information to investigators. So there's a whole range of techniques here. And this is just another recent study from the CSRA around sources of bias they found in construction investigations using case studies. So as expected, confirmation bias was observed quite often, around 30%. So in other words, the investigators structured their interviews based on the initial presumptions they had stated in their pre-simulation survey. So what that means is, so confirmation bias is where you essentially look for evidence that confirms your beliefs, and you're more critical about evidence that challenges or disconfirms it. So they interviewed people before the fact, before they had all the data from this investigation around, what do you think were the root causes? What do you think were the causal factors? What caused this accident? And they gave their spin, and then they were introduced to the data. And they found around 30% of the interviews that were really strongly aligned. So the evidence didn't change their initial impressions, even if the evidence didn't necessarily support it. And in fact, in some cases, this is from the study, the investigator devoted considerable time of the interview to unearthing their pre-existing ideas about accident causality. Whereas in other cases, the entire interview was devoted to this facet. So what that means is some of these investigators weren't really out there trying to understand the context, the specific factors involved in this incident. They were really heavily focused, laser focused on confirming their existing sort of mental model, their accident model, that I think this was due to this procedure not being used. So they looked deep for this evidence that supported that. So what they found was, or they concluded, many interviews focused only on one specific aspect of the event where repetition was common, and the investigator kept circling back to the same factor. And most participants didn't ask questions to challenge their personal notions of what may have happened, which strengthens the evidence of a confirmation bias. So they didn't ask really challenging questions of themselves against their own sort of ideas and their own assumptions around the accident. Now, they found some other biases, but I think that was probably enough just to frame this sort of topic. And I think another assumption around investigations is based on the incident data itself. And maybe this one's a little bit of a tangent, but we rely a lot on our injury and incident data in organizations. So we run a lot of monthly reports. Some organizations make quite a lot of decisions based on these types of reports. I'm not saying all of them do it equally, but to do that, you would have to assume that we at least trust the data even a little bit. And there's been some really useful international, global data that suggests that even up to somewhere around 80% of the incidents that are experienced by people go unreported. This was found across multiple organizations like in the US and Italy. It was found in manufacturing, utilities, health services, hospitality. So somewhere around, for every 3 incidents that a worker experiences, only 1 gets reported. Similarly, in construction, over 80% of reportable incidents were not reported to OSHA. And even in companies that had good safety climate, so they're rated high on safety climate measures, somewhere still up nearly 50% of those experienced incidents weren't reported to OSHA. You might think, well, surely we can trust that more severe incidents are representative of reality then. If the minor ones aren't, yeah, I can get it. Someone scratches their arm, steel fixes, they're always getting little hurty fingers. dealing with sharp, pointy steel. But surely the more severe ones are representative. Well, maybe, but there was a recent study from Kevin Geddert and Sid Decker and Drew Ray that found that injury severity, at least in one large Australian energy company, they found that injury severity in the recordable classifications were poorly connected. So what they found was actually only 19% of injuries which were accepted for insurance compensation when it had to get for work cover for injury compensation, only 20%, 90% of them were classified as recordable in the internal incident management system. And further, only 17% of high severity injuries and 33% of very high severity injuries were classified as recordable. Just think about that. Only somewhere between 17 to 33% of very high severity injuries were classed as recordable injuries within this organization. And we don't have any reason to believe that organization was doing anything different to anywhere else, at least in Australia or that industry. So in their view, the default assumption for any company should be that recordable or reportable injuries are not representative of the severity and nature of actual injuries. So we should be at least a little bit skeptical. And now going to this idea around multi-causality or multifactorial. I'm not going to dwell on this much. I think most people in this day and age, and probably for a long time, understand there's lots of different factors that influence accidents. It's been recognised for a long, long time, at least, 120 years, probably longer. I've seen rail investigations from the 1800s that have talked about multiple factors. So it's probably always been known. I think it sometimes doesn't necessarily really properly sort of load or get represented in investigations at times around the key narrative, how we actually sell the story. And I'll talk about narrative later. But I think here what's important is where do we draw the line on the margins and what's in and out of scope? Again, depends on your accident model. If you see accidents usually as, I'm not going to say complex, but have multiple factors, contracting, different staffing, knowledge, risk perceptions, equipment, all that sort of stuff, then you're inevitably going to construct those causes. If you see it more simply, it's usually a factor of behavior. Like those people just don't follow the rules. They don't care. Then inevitably that's what you're going to construct in your investigation. And my point here is around construct. All of these are probably valid perspectives in some sense. They probably represent reality in some sense, but it's really what we can't say is they're truly objective, independent, neutral interpretations. I think another important unspoken principle or assumption around investigations is, again, this ties into that objectivity. What they actually have are unspoken stop rules. And these stop rules exist whether you realize it or not, whether they're formalized or not. So stop rules are the point that you practically stop investigating something. There's always a point where you have to draw a line in the sand, like when you complete your ICAM, your investigation, and you trace back so far happened on the Wednesday, you've gone back to the Tuesday and looked at how they set up site the day before, you've looked at maybe the weather last couple of days. But these are all stop rules. Like, why do you go back 1 or 2 days? Why don't you go back to the week before? Why don't you go back to the start of the project with contracts and setup? These are largely pragmatic, informal and subjective rules that we sort of work by, we live by, until we find an acceptable answer. But we find something that satisfies our own internal accident model, our worldview. We find that acceptable cause or causes of the accident. We find something like error, the procedure, the equipment, or a few of these. We find 3 things that we say these are the main factors. Or we run out of time, we run out of money, or we can't practically trace the incident any further backwards or further up into the organization. So these are really important constraints that investigations and most sort of work has around these stop rules. And I'll give you some examples. So there's a really cool study from Lundberg that looked at the disconnect between what investigations find or construct versus what they actually fix. So it's not just what you look for is what you find. If the one thing you take out of today, take what you look for is what you find. I apply it everywhere. But it's also what you find isn't what you necessarily fix. So Lundberg found in a range of these investigations that what we fix investigations, like we found some factor with the contract or the site establishment or the equipment maintenance. But what we fixed might have been different to that. So we fixed things that we were able to readily understand, or what we could afford to investigate, or the people we could talk to, or the people we couldn't talk to influenced what we fixed. What we dared to find influenced what we fixed. So I said before about clients, quite often clients are out of scope, even though they should be in scope. It's a bit of a taboo topic. We fix what we know how to fix. So based on our own expertise, our specialist, we fix what we were going to fix anyway. And this one I find everywhere. There's certain things that we were going to do anyway, even if we hadn't formally discussed it. But there's just really easy, low-hanging fruit, easy fixes that we probably should be doing because it's in our process. So let's just do it now. We fix on what we can afford to fix and all these sort of things. Anyway, there's a whole range of these factors that influence. The point is, again, investigations probably aren't as objective as we sometimes sell to ourselves or to others. Next, I want to go into, do investigations actually result in any better outcomes in organizations? You would think if we're doing it so much, and we do, we invest so much time into this, shouldn't we expect to be achieving some sort of gains or improvements from them? And as it turns out, we don't actually have a lot of good evidence that this is the case. I find that really unusual. It's the same with quite a lot of processes actually in safety and practice. We don't have a lot of really good, robust, rigorous evidence that these techniques help improve or achieve their goals, whatever their goals are. But I have found a number of studies, mostly from healthcare, that have looked at the influence of investigations and root cause analyses, corrective actions. So I've covered about a dozen or more of these studies. And what we have is we have far more evidence that investigations aren't improving most indices that are most of the things they're measured on, at least in healthcare. Now, that doesn't mean like the absence of evidence isn't, an absence of effect, but I think what it does do is shift the onus of evidence to the people who claim that investigations are valid, they're useful, they're improving outcomes. Now, I'm not arguing we shouldn't be investigating. I'm not saying that at all, but we should at least expect some decent evidence that they're working as intended. And maybe a lot of organizations do have really good data and it's just not published. But anyway, we have to just work on what we've got. So a number of these healthcare studies have a common thread. And what they say is, despite this constant cycle of root cause analyses and investigations being promoted as a critical process for preventing incident reoccurrence, some of this research says that the most recent studies don't confirm that finding. In fact, based on a whole range of studies, investigations don't seem to produce enough benefits to address the underlying issue and thus avoid possible repeat incidents. In only 2 studies out of a range that they actually looked at in one of these studies could a link be established with investigations and some improved outcomes. Now, I say outcomes, of course, we shouldn't just be focused on outcomes. We should be focused on inputs, improving the inputs, but this was focused on outcomes too. And what they found is, to no one's surprise, investigation actions weren't always coupled with the contributing factors. So they found a gap in something, but the actions didn't actually address that gap. They found that all the time. And of course, active errors were the key focus. The actions were frequently focused on, at the very front line, sharp end interface where people are working. So they concluded it's not clear if root cause analysis is effective in preventing reoccurrence. And then I've got a few other studies. I'll just have to gloss over them given time. But another one looked at over 300 investigations over an 8-year period. They found that most of the actions or the improvements were training, process change, or policy reinforcement. Same in construction, you'll find the same everywhere, and just a bunch of those sorts of findings across all these studies that just they don't seem to be improving much. And what they are improving is just this very low effectiveness types of controls that aren't really strongly coupled to what they found in the investigation. And in fact, one of these studies, this was their quote, time spent in repeatedly investigating similar incidents may be better spent aggregating and thematically analysing the full range of existing sources of information about patient safety. So what they're saying is, why go through Groundhog Day every day with this same investigation, these same things, when you've probably already got the solutions or the data you need to prevent it? It's already there. You just need to do more work on learning and integrating. This one here is one of the more insightful ones I've covered. What they consistently find is investigations have really sophisticated means for building shopping lists of causal factors, but very few have any structured process for generating risk control recommendations. So they're good at unearthing issues, but not very good at actually directing and providing guidance on how to generate better quality improvements. Just another study, again, I'm not going to dwell on it too long. I think I've already made the point, but again, they found that the types of improvements that came out of a whole range of root cause analyses, investigations were, again, largely lower tier, lower order effectiveness improvements, training and rewriting processes. And just think about it, right? Let's say you have a confined space entry, a string of confined space entry issues. There's an issue with where people enter the confined space that haven't followed, our expectations around the gas monitoring, bump tests, whatever it is. So we do the investigation. We've done 3 of them, 3 ICAMs. It's largely the same thing. And each time we tweak the process, we rewrite it. This is now the new process. When you think about it, we haven't actually changed the way that they enter the confined space. We've just changed the abstraction of that work, the document. And they're not the same thing. We hope that they're directly connected. We hope that the confined-space entry process, the written procedure, we hope that it's connected to the work. In fact, our whole safety management system is based on this logic that there's some sort of connection, but they're not actually the same thing. One's a routine, one's the actual thing that someone does, and one's just an abstraction of it, written by probably someone else. Now, again, that's not saying we shouldn't have processes. I think we should, but we haven't actually changed the way that they establish the work, they think about the work, they do the work, they're resourced for the work. And this is what these sort of studies find. It's always pitched at the frontline people, but very rarely upstream organizational factors that create those conditions to begin with. Now, sometimes it will just be that people didn't follow the procedure. I'm not trying to say that we should always try and find organizational factors, but I think that we should start there and try and exhaust our options first, because even just, this isn't even based on all this fandangled new view sociologist theory, as I've been told in interviews. It's based on just basic human factors. It's based on the hierarchy of control. Like, it's just very foundational safety practice in most parts of the world. I covered most of this before around the strength of the risk controls. They're usually pretty poor. Somewhere around only 15% are actually higher order controls. The rest are just all the usual sort of filler junk. But here's an interesting finding from one of these studies. One reason for the often poor match between the risk controls that come out of an investigation versus what they found, the contributing factors, is a perceived imperative for investigators to recommend less resource-intensive controls within the scope of the organisation. So the stop rules, there it is. It comes up again, stop rules. And more effective risk controls may require more specialist expertise from like human factors engineering and designing forcing functions and whatnot. And just very quickly, I focus on healthcare, but we have some research from Australian construction, in fact from US construction too. But this was a study that looked at 100 Australian ICAM investigations. And again, without labouring the same arguments, no, I'm beating that horse. They argued that Australian ICAMs, as of this study, hadn't moved past a focus on human error. In fact, they found most of the investigations didn't really even connect the factors. They were very just isolated things just sitting out there in the ether. But almost all of them sat at the very low level, the frontline operator level, the corrective actions. And here's another study. Actually, this one I just mentioned, I forgot I had it on this slide, called that lack of situational awareness, human error. Leslie Stockel's data from the US, she equally found that a significant finding in her data was the presence of a disconnect between the identified causes of the incidents and the recommendations for corrective or preventative action. In fact, none of the reports included recommended corrective actions that fully addressed the precursor causes for the incident. So there's a strong disconnect. We're talking about serious incidents here. So an example is there was a failure to conduct an effective pre-task hazard identification, but the fix was doing a toolbox talk. So it's sort of similar to my example around the confined space. We do a pre-start or a toolbox on this is the process, but we haven't really unpacked the process of doing confined space entry, the actual work, the routine itself. This one's relevant. This is from the Australian Queensland mining data, Sean Brady, the Brady Review. They looked at all of the fatal accidents in Queensland mine inquiries over about a 20-year period. And I think this one's really illuminating. So they found that less than 30% of the controls implemented following a serious accident or fatality was a hard control. Hard being elimination, substitution, isolation, or engineering. Less than 30% of things that killed people or could have killed people. So administrative controls were, of course, the most dominant type of control in serious cases. In one of the time periods, 60% of all high potential incidents and 68% of serious accidents were administrative. So what Sean argued is if this is representative of how the industry actually responds to serious accidents, then it's concerning. It means that a hazard which had the demonstrated capacity to kill or require a person to be admitted to hospital for treatment was responded to with a control that was among the least effective in the hierarchy. And just further on the data, 45% of the controls were ineffective, 36% of the hazards were unidentified, and only a small number of the events involved a bypass or unenforced control. So what that's suggesting from this data set, Queensland mining, in most cases there was some control there, but either it wasn't effective as expected, there was a gap in identifying the hazard to begin with, and only a smaller number where there wasn't any sort of control. Let's unpack language. Language really matters. Of course it matters. I think most people would agree. There's a cool article I highly recommend you dig up from Krista Vessel, which explores the role of agentive language. So people naturally want to know who or what was responsible for an action or something that bad that happened. So the assignment of action is called agency, where an agent is a person or a thing that takes an active role or produces an effect. We might have an example where Bob spilled the chemical, where Bob is the agent. But this simplistic sentence doesn't tell us whether Bob spilled the chemical intentionally, by accident, or was simply near the chemical when it spilled. You could just as likely say the vase broke instead of Bob broke the vase, or the chemical spilled rather than Bob spilled the chemical. But one of the effects of this agency is we likely assume that the agent of the action acted independently and made a free will choice to act. And these assumptions influence learning from events. So we actually do have quite a number of studies that show that agency, how we assign, just that simple word changes. And in fact, I don't know if I've got it here, but there was a really large study of legal cases in the UK over like 100 years, something ridiculous. And they found a really strong predictor of the severity of the outcome, or whether a prosecution was successful, whether guilty or not guilty. So what they found was if you framed it like, this person was negligent, that person did this or didn't do something, then they're more likely to have a guilty plea. I'm butchering the findings, but it's something like that. Whereas when it was less agentive, they were more likely to have a not guilty or a less severe finding. And there's other research that shows that not directly the same thing. Like I've covered this on my YouTube in a video. Even something like the temperature on the day, or whether the judge's football team or baseball team won or lost the night before, influences the severity of the judgments. They don't realize they're doing that, but if they're really grumpy because their team lost, they're more likely to, if it's a hot day, they're more likely to give more severe. If it's closer to lunchtime and they're hungry, it's more likely to be severe. So the point is, there's a range of these factors that aren't directly related to the incident or the harm that influence the outcomes. Really beautiful video from Johan Bergstrom. I highly, highly recommend you check out his video. It's beautiful. It's a 101 in how language influences investigations when we don't even intend it. So I won't go through it too much because I recommend you watch the video, but we have counterfactual reasoning. So counterfactual reasoning is when the investigator is discussing a case that never happened. It's like a parallel universe, like the pilot did not initiate or the pilot did not have are said to be indications of the counterfactual trap. So they're discussing an incident that didn't actually happen. Another example is when investigators hypothesize different scenarios that may involve keywords like if, had, would likely, would have. And these types of counterfactual statements, I actually wrote about counterfactuals in one of my auditing papers I published, prioritizes analysis of what the system didn't do rather than what it did do. By saying what if only they did X, Y, Z, we're describing something that never happened rather than what did happen and how and why that did happen. So what he says is, by doing this sort of counterfactual logics, it ignores an analysis of why it made sense for the system to act in the way that it did when it did. And then we have normative language where we imply our own judgments. It was egregious. They put their own values into it without realizing. They mismanaged. It was inappropriate. I'm going to skip over the rest, but I've got an example here. This was a real case study that I've modified. I've primed it. But here's some of these words, the language that might turn up. Very dangerous. That's a value judgment. The water jet obviously could kill and they should have known better. This violated company rules. Violate is a very loaded word. Macho, get things done. Shortcutting is still a very loaded word. And they could have done things more safe. You get the point. These words creep in there. We don't intend it. We're not directly blaming people often. In fact, I find it's less likely now that we just directly blame someone with really loaded language. And more often, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, more often it's sort of masked, it hides within softer pseudo-scientific language, situational awareness and things like that. And just some of my reflections around, some of these counterfactual and normative judgments. And now this is the last slide before we go into what does potentially another way of looking at it look like. This is my own view. I think investigations are really well geared for solving yesterday's incident that's already happened and may never happen again in that particular configuration. I think what they're less good at is designing what better work looks like tomorrow, better, safer, more efficient, more reliable, better resource, better planned work tomorrow. They're not the same thing. They might be the same thing, yesterday's incident and better work tomorrow, but I don't think they necessarily are. And, here's Holnagel's argument around, we do a task 1,000 times. It goes wrong once and we investigate it. That's sensible. But we largely ignore the 999 times it went right or went most of the time went relatively right. It went successfully, it achieved our goals. And we don't investigate that. It's kind of like just in the background. We're blind to it. And it's kind of strange how that works, I think, because when nothing happens, as far as no incidents, we kind of assume that nothing's happening. And actually, Carl Weick called it a dynamic nut event. And we assume that because nothing is happening, there's nothing worth to learn about. But in fact, there is lots of stuff to learn about. In fact, most of the time, things aren't really going catastrophically wrong. So we have all these potentials to learn from and to improve from. This isn't talking about abandoning investigations. I think they actually are really useful. They give a lot of impetus to learning. They can obviously shut down learning in some organizations, but they usually get quite a bit of attention. We get the time with people. We get some imperative to learn, but we're so limited if we're just looking at that one tiny slither, the incident rather than all the times that normally the task, the daily variability, the ups and downs. And I think here I wrote this comment down. But your definition of safety, your mental model will shape what you find. Again, you'll see this embedded everywhere. Here's an alternative way to think about it and just to maybe tweak and try. But I really like the idea of first and second stories. First stories, this idea comes from Woods and Richard Cook and others. First stories are these very truncated, linear, mechanistic interpretations. It's human error, violation, complacency. It's saying what people should have done. It's telling people to be more careful. And often they don't usually say that very specifically, be more careful. It's like, follow the procedure. They'll get retrained to make sure they understand the procedure. Here's an example. They found this in that ICAM study, that Australian one, and some other research. And I've found in my audit study, we often assign toolboxes and communications and training for findings that aren't related to someone's knowledge about a process. So you would think you would do training when someone lacks some sort of information or application, like they didn't understand the permit to work process. So we give them training and instruction and coaching. Yep, that's reasonable. But often what was found is it didn't relate to their specific knowledge of that process. It was other things, but we still train them on that process. So that's a very first story. So what's probably really useful is to push towards second stories. So human error is seen as an effect. It's a byproduct of deeper, wider system vulnerabilities. Again, you can't always do this. You won't always need to do this as far as making every simple little incident about an organizational disaster. But it's about trying to mature our approach, our thinking. Now, counterfactuals are really useful. For risk assessments, thinking about what could have been is really useful. There's things like upwards and downwards counterfactuals. But for trying to explain an incident, it's a very slippery slope with counterfactuals because, like Johan said there, describing a reality that didn't occur. So second stories are talking about trying to explain using a narrative about why it made sense for a person to do what they did or the system to act like it did. It's not making excuses. It's not trying to abrogate accountability, but it's contextualizing why it made sense. They wouldn't have done what they did if it didn't make sense to them, unless it was like a pure brain fart, slip sort of thing. But most of the time, people do what they did at the time because it made some sort of sense to them. So you need to understand that. How can you fix and improve things if you don't even understand the context? And I see so many investigations that do this. I send them back where it says they failed to follow the procedure. And that's given to me as the whole finding. I'm like, bro, that's not the finding. That's the start of the sentence. Where's the rest of it? They didn't follow the procedure because, why did it make sense? Did they understand the procedure? How did they normally do the task? Is the procedure used? Is the procedure useful, valid, accurate? Does it have utility? What are the climates and cultures? Do they normally follow the procedure? How was the task done last time? How was it done last week? There's all these questions we should be asking, at least with high potential learnings, and then constantly obviously trying to seek out system and organizational vulnerabilities wherever possible. So yes, I think investigations are good at describing the minute details of yesterday, but not so good for preventing tomorrow's accident that hasn't happened yet, crafting better, more reliable, effective work. That's the context, the local rationality. Why did it make sense? Why did people do what they did or the system behaved like it did? I'm going to gloss over this, not going to deep dive too much, but consider different types of actual investigation tools. We call it accident models, but in this context, obviously that's our cognitive worldview. But consider things like the AXIMAPs, STAMP or CAST, even the Swiss cheese applications from the ATSB, CAST and other investigation and regulatory bodies. They have some really cool stuff. But what I want to do preface that is all of these tools have their own limitations. And it's not just, and in fact, I strongly disagree with this idea that the tool isn't the problem, it's the person. I think that lets off tools too easily. We know we have good scientific evidence around validity, about reliability. We know that some tools, some surveys, some whatever, aren't very good for their core goals. They're not very good for bringing out the best qualities of people. They have poor content or ecological validity. So anyway, I think that's a complete fallacy, that it's not the tool, it's the person. We know from scientifically you can easily challenge that and show that some tools just straight up suck. Terrible reliability, poor content or ecological or construct validity, all those sort of things. And second, they don't necessarily bring out the best qualities in people. If we keep having these same issues, at what point do we stop and say, maybe it's not the people, maybe it's the tool here, maybe the tool is central. It's not bringing out the required or the best qualities of humans. So anyway, systems tools can be really useful here. Again, they come with their own constraints. They will shape worldviews, but everything does. But they at least give you a really good framework. And I'm not saying not to use ICAM. Even ICAM gets you to think about absent controls. It gets you to think about the process flow, the organizational factors. But the challenge or the limitation or the nuance with any tool is sometimes, we know this from other evidence, that sometimes we can get so focused on just answering what's on that sheet. We find evidence, we torture data to fit those categories. So it goes through a process of construction, and we might miss other data that doesn't neatly fit into those categories. And systems models, that happens too, but they do give you more prompts and more avenues to try and fit or massage the data into those neat categories. What can we do better? Well, what's another way of looking at it? I think a useful alternative approach is, this is my preference, is to focus on sticky, the things that kill people. Check out my recent YouTube video around better indicators, because this ties in really strongly. So I'm not promoting just like the ICMM's for critical control or the HSG 254, which is shown on the screen. Check out my article and check out my YouTube. But they do give us a very good focus on the critical sort of control systems. How do the risk control systems function? What are the most important things for the business? How do we know that they're working? What questions do we ask in the investigation that helps us understand whether that system worked? What was in place? What should have been in place? What was in place and how did it function as expected? What did people understand about that risk control system? What else exists in industry to help us with that system? This one's important. I think most people are aware of this work is done versus work is imagined, or the black and blue line sold by other people. Stephen Shorrock is really cool article from Stephen. His link's there in red. You go straight to his blog. Awesome blog. Subscribe, support him. He's broken down to work is imagined, disclosed, prescribed, and done. But that's what investigations should be doing. That second story isn't coming up with a single coherent narrative. You're not saying this is what happened. You're saying these are different interpretations. So this is something I try and promote as much as possible, is an investigation doesn't need to have a single coherent A, B, C, this is what happened. You can provide conflicts. The supervisor said this. The worker said that. The manager believes this, the evidence, the data shows this. You don't have to get to a single story. In fact, by having multiple narratives, you have more opportunities to fix. You have more leverage points, as Donella Meadows would say in her book, Thinking in Systems. You have more leverage points by having more narratives. Try and fix something that corresponds with all of those factors, the socio-technical system. But I think investigations do need to be better focused on work as done, the actual daily work, the variability. What happened today? How did it happen today? What happened yesterday? What happened last week? What does better work look like tomorrow? And you may not get that out of investigations. You might need to run other types of learning activities, facilitated and informal tools, like learning teams maybe. I'm not just spruiking learning teams, but that's an alternative. But you can easily find lots of books and structured sort of ways to apply it. So you're not out there on your own. You can just buy a few books and they'll give you a decent process to get it up and running. There's things like 4Ds or better questions, pre-action investigations, pre-mortems, post-mortems, which is postmortems are pretty similar investigations. But anyway, what I'm largely arguing is better questions will probably lead to better learnings. And better learnings have better opportunity to learn to better improvements over time. I've referenced this study. It's on my YouTube, it's on my pod, it's on my blog. If you're interested, you can read the study on there and listen to it, watch it. Here's another one around using safety 2. I'm not spruiking safety 2. I'm not saying HOT, I'm not saying UView, but this is one study which I liked its findings. What they found was investigations weren't very good at describing actual daily work, like the barriers that staff face actually using controls and precautions and whatnot. Didn't describe how they normally solve problems. It didn't really unpack misalignments that look at weaknesses in systems. It didn't look at holistic and systematic learning after incidents. It didn't really look at high, broader policy problems. So what they suggested, include a description of how the task or process is usually carried out in practice before considering what happened in this case under investigation. Although, mind you, I think that's a good idea, but you do have to be mindful that that is a source of biasing. So McLean's research from earlier does show that the more information you give an investigator beforehand, the more they're going to use counterfactuals. They're going to think about and come up with their own plausible accident explanations. So there is a risk of bias. Discuss the adaptations and adjustments. So, what I find a really useful way for investigations is follow what makes work difficult. If you follow what makes work difficult, you're going to find really critical safety issues, gaps, misunderstandings, ineffective process, like all those sort of things. Workarounds. And when you consider that these workarounds don't just happen in a vacuum, they happen because that process isn't delivering the value that that person needs at that time or in a quick enough format or whatever, but it gives you more leverage points. There's narratives, so moving towards more narrative. I'm not going to unpack too much here, but this is that thing about an investigation shouldn't just be this really inert, clinical dot points, executive summary. Don't be afraid to have a larger, wilder version that goes through a narrative. It gives multiple stories. That's not War and Peace. You're not making a novel, but don't skimp on the critical details. It provides the necessary context, gives you more leverage points. So we do have some research that says that, yeah, maybe you should be doing this, more of this narrative style in your reports. There's existing tools to help you focus on why did it make sense to you. So Louise Rowe's recent studies on my blog, you can find a link to her full paper, but this is extract questions. There's a range of questions you can ask. It's not saying you go through this systematically one by one, but these give you better questions to ask investigations. So I use similar questions in my own investigations, in my own prompts. Something I forgot to mention right at the start too, this is important. I'm only focused on investigations, even though I think investigations are a very limited slice of learning. But most of this stuff equally applies to daily learning. You really need to create your own opportunities for learning, not rely on investigations, not relying on that 1 out of 1,000. So we need to create opportunities for better learning. But these questions help expand and ask better questions, better learnings. So I'm not going to go through them all, but it's understanding local rationality, context, stop rules, what we're hearing, seeing. This is one of the classics. So this one's pretty common. You'll probably have heard about the critical decision method. It's used in healthcare. It's used in police investigations in some places. These questions were fed into Louise's more recent checklist, but really solid. What were you hearing, seeing, smelling? What information were you using? What information were you expecting but didn't have? What were your goals at the time? We're speaking to the operator who was involved in an incident. If you stopped just before the incident, how would you have explained the situation to a colleague at that time? Were you concerned about anything? What were you seeing and noticing? There's some really cool prompts that you can feed in. What I suggest is this isn't just training. This isn't a toolbox. You actually need to inject these sorts of questions, these prompts into your structures too. So it's not like you'll have 20 questions in your investigation, but try and feed this language and wording and prompts as best you can into certain phrases and prompts. And then you do training and instruction and coaching in the field and in formalized training. You use little notes like field notes where you have a little one-pager that gives you 3 questions. You prime your leaders to ask these questions during their leadership engagements around understanding work and controls, what makes work hard, all those sort of things. There's heaps of really good books and instructions around this. There's things like the walk-through, talk-through, and better questions. But Marston's book goes through a lot of this stuff too, which is really cool. The walk-through, talk-through, and there's a whole range of techniques like walk-through, talk-through, but really cool, proactive learning. You learn from daily work. You'll look at error traps, where an error trap is pretty much the situational context where if you replace one person with another, they're still more likely to have some sort of error, because it's not to do with them, it's to do with the situation. So there's tools that we can find this. Marston talks about in his book around setting up our risk assessments to look at these factors too. That was the risk assessment one, so I'm going to flick over that. There's his book. So this is my own views. I'm not saying that you should believe this. I'm not saying this is true, accurate, but my thoughts are safety is, among lots of other things, the presence of effective risk control. So it's more than just the absence of incidents. People make mistakes, so look for ways to improve the environment that people work within. This isn't, again, just this harebrained sociologist new view thing. This comes from basic human factors research from like 100 years ago. And hazardous energy causes harm. Now, it doesn't cause all the harm. We have psychosocial, we have mental ill health and things. But for physical, if you eliminate or reduce the energy and people's interaction with the energy, you will prevent physical harm. You have to have a source of physical energy to result in some sort of physical loss or injury or incident, more or less. Maybe you'll find edge cases, but generally that's pretty safe. But we can go too far with all this sort of thinking. So trying to avoid blame, I should have mentioned blame earlier, but it was just a basic assumption that we all agree that we should reduce and minimize blame. But we can go too far. So one study from the CSRA found that investigators were so focused on avoiding blame that it shaped their findings, and they made claims that they couldn't support, like, oh, don't worry, we're not going to blame anyone, you won't be in trouble. They said this stuff right at the start before they even started the investigation. And they did everything possible to avoid focusing on the humans' actions and decisions or inactions. And the authors sort of say tongue in cheek, it kind of potentially pushes us back to acts of God where it's not to do with us. It just happens. It's just one of those things. And in fact, another study suggested that some level of blame logics, and it's very particular and nuanced around what it defines as blame, but it found that this sense that, I'm going to be held to account, I'm going to be, in a sense, blamed, actually improved learning opportunities. So we can go too far with some of these ideas. If you're interested, there's the books I suggest. These aren't necessarily about investigations. These are just general readings that I think will help frame your thinking around risk controls, effectiveness. Desi's book does cover incidents, the legal perspective, but these ones are all solid reads to help push thinking. And there's links. This will be on YouTube. All right, that's it. Now, I'm going to have a look back in the chat. We can't have no lens look at the world. So absolutely right. There's no way to look at the world for most people. Now, there probably is, if we have some neuroscientists or doctors here, there might be some brain injuries and brain architecture conditions where some people are able to effectively disconnect themselves from that part of the prefrontal cortex, whatever. Maybe there probably are some sort of quirks. David, yes, it's the idea of individually necessary but ain't jointly sufficient. Yes, so David Woods and others argue that these things that we find in investigations, we construct investigations, are often they're necessary for that accident to have happened, but they're only jointly sufficient for it to happen. So there's really little point trying to pick on one factor and say that's the root cause, because at least in complex, major sort of high energy failures, like in large IT system failure, cloud servers, nuclear reactors and planes, there's usually a cascading of these interactions, these factors across the system, and any one of them can amplify the effects. Research limitations, useful to share that each research limitation will understand the finding could not be generalized to other industry. Yes, you're right. So really important. If I had 2 hours, I would have said what the limitations are for each study. But let's look at it from another perspective. Can anybody find me counter evidence that most of these factors aren't observable? Now, again, the absence of evidence doesn't show that that is or isn't a factor. You're absolutely right. So the limitations are always important, but we have at least 12 to 15 studies from healthcare arguing and showing that from their large data sets over multiple years, multiple hospitals, investigations aren't improving things. So what that does is, that's not proof. So proof exists in maths. It doesn't exist in science. We disconfirm, we disprove, but we can't prove ultimately. Mathematicians can. So we have evidence that disconfirms hypotheses, and what we do is we shift the burden of evidence. So if we have 12, 15, 20 studies demonstrating that investigations aren't improving things, what we're doing is we're shifting the burden of evidence. Now, it's up to the people that claim that investigations are improving things to counter with robust, rigorous evidence. And we don't have it. There's very little published evidence on investigations improve things. Now, again, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm not saying they don't work, but the evidence does need to shift. If we're arguing, we invest a lot of time into these things, we should at least be able to show some evidence. And I'm not saying there's nothing there. David said, from Sydney Decker, second stories always take longer to come out. They need time. That's absolutely right. The second stories, again, this is one of those common myths, is we're not trying to remove accountability or responsibility, but what we are trying to do is situate why it made sense for that person. And this is an example I give in some of these major incidents that I had investigated. Heads have to roll. Why did they do that? It's so stupid. It doesn't make any sense. When I hear those words, that's a good coaching opportunity. If it didn't make sense, that's your limitation. That's not a limitation of the person involved. It's because you don't understand enough of the situation, the context, their thinking, the decisions to be able to understand it. So maybe you should go out there and ask the question. You should understand. If you understand the context, you may not agree with the context, but you'll understand the context better, why it made sense. Matt English was saying, how do you measure the prevention of incidents? So this is a really good one, actually. I don't know if this is exactly what Matt was getting to, but you can't measure things that don't happen. And this is that dynamic non-event argument from Carl Weick, and James Reason has spoken about it. Now, obviously, you can track incidents going down, but you can't strictly measure things that don't happen. So it is a real challenge. It is a constraint. It is a limitation. And this is something that there's a paradox of ultra-safe systems. So aviation, nuclear ran into this issue decades ago. They became so safe that they didn't have enough incidents to actually investigate and learn from. So they had to create opportunities for learning, for the design reviews and engineering and other feedback mechanisms. And construction's nowhere near that point, but the logics are still the same. Incidents are still, relatively speaking, very rare events. And, Hallowell's and the CSRA's research around just how statistically infrequent and rare these things are, they require so much data to have a statistical power, like a sufficient power. So instead, we need to count and measure and learn from other things. And you know what? This isn't a newfangled idea. The quality movement, total quality management from Deming and Shewhart and all them, the Toyota method, they cracked this nut decades and decades ago, back from the 50s and whatever. You need to get better at looking at the inputs, the things that create those sort of stable outputs. You can measure those, you can learn from those, improve those. In fact, Deming had this quote around, you can't inspect quality into a process. And I'm probably extending it beyond what he was saying, but focusing on the outcomes will only ever give you a very sliced, biased input. So Desi, yes, might that data be skewed by the view that administrative controls are almost always reasonably practicable? and therefore the duty requires it to be implemented. Yes, I think that could be a valid point, but how many of those things are actually legislated? I would argue that very few of the things, the administrative controls we put in place, investigations, have a legal basis. So yes, maybe they are reasonably practicable, but if the overarching duty is to eliminate or mitigate the risk of exposure, and we legally have to apply the hierarchy of controls, I would suggest the onus really should be on us, of course, using as many higher order controls, but justifying why we couldn't apply those controls. Justify even to ourselves that we've done everything we reasonably could, practically could, to eliminate those hazards. So yes, I agree, Desi, that's probably a very apt view. So Sharon, the reverse would be to complete and utilize better risk assessment tools to improve our identification of risk. Yes, I strongly agree. So this idea of pre-accident investigations, pre-mortems, what could go wrong? If we're debriefing in a year's time, we're pretending that we've done this program based on our current plans and it failed catastrophically. Pre-mortem, 101. What failed? What do we think failed? What do we need to look at now to prevent that? Risk assessments really should, in fact, Drew Ray, check out my interview with Drew and check out Drew's work around risk assessments. Check out his podcast, Disaster Cast. It is the best 101 in safety science and safety risk principles. I listen to it multiple times every year. So Disaster Cast's a little bit harder to find, but honestly, listen to it back to front multiple times. Drew has a really insightful episode about risk assessments. Risk assessments should be getting us to think about better options. And he uses the Lord of the Rings example, where the hobbits have to get to wherever they're going, and they have to pass through landowners. So the risk assessment should be identifying who the landowners are, who has to engage with them. What happens if we don't get approval to cross through the landowner's land? What do we do about, riding horses? That means blisters, so we have to do checks. The risk assessment should be giving us better prompts to think about and to address. And what he said was sometimes we get so enamored with trying to just debate risk on things that we were never going to consider anyway. This is what the risk is. And then spend the rest of the time debating the different options. What are we going to do about it? And use the risk assessment time just to debate what we're going to do, rather than mostly focusing on all these minute likelihood consequence sort of nonsense, which aren't going to influence what we're going to do anyway. What he's saying is we've already decided we're going to fix it. So let's just discuss what we're going to do to fix it. Incident data doesn't tell the whole story about risk and sticky from Kerry. Yep, absolutely agree. And also, it doesn't tell the whole story. You're right. Even if it was accurate as far as serious incidents, we can probably expect quite often they probably do represent most of the serious incidents that happen on site, at least actuals, but it's always filtered through people to varying degrees. So there's examples from major accidents, like at the King's Cross fire in the UK. It's like in the 80s. And instead of reporting fire, they reported smolder. Smolder doesn't sound as bad. There's examples like that where we filter, and the more filtering layers it goes through, no one intended to obfuscate, to hide the fire, but add smoke and things like that. So yes, they get filtered. They get filtered through different levels. There is a tension from Matt between accountability and responsibility by the systems of work and how people make sense of them. Yep, strongly agree. From Healy, in Australia, do you think our legislation framework lends itself to blame? It's certainly effective for regulators, legal accountability. I think that's a really interesting one. I'm not sure I really have a thought on that one, Healy. I think that Desi and lawyers would be better placed. But my reflection, a bit broader, is I don't think that the legislation is very onerous in itself, but there's this idea of neoliberalism. So a lot of Western European and Australian Anglo countries have moved toward this neoliberal, where the regulation, governments take a step back and allow industry to do a little bit more self-regulation. So our legislation, health and safety in Australia, is performance-based. It doesn't prescribe a whole lot of stuff, but it says you have high-level duties so far as reasonably practicable, etc. Now, what was supposed to have happened in theory was by taking a step back, it reduces bureaucracy and paperwork, but it's had kind of the opposite effect. When the government gets less involved, less prescriptive, it seems to be that industry overcompensate by creating more bureaucracy because we're worried about what will happen when it gets to court because we don't have really clear delineation around what the expectation will be in court. Now, obviously, there's a lot of legal precedent, there's codes of practice and whatever. So there is some guidance, but it seemed to have generated this really high focus on bureaucracy. All right, that's it. Thanks, everyone.